Good afternoon, everybody. I'd like to begin by wishing you all a happy new year, hoping that maybe next year will be better. I know it's been rough on me, and I think many people have found it difficult. So we're really looking to the end of the term. The term formally ends on the 19th, and uh, that is the day that your essay is due. And it's the day that I'm supposed to distribute the exam. Now, on that matter, I think that it depends on how soon we finish the classwork. If I finish the classwork before then, I think I will give the exam out earlier. That's basically what I would say. Um, are there any questions about this? And I think if there are questions of getting an extension and so on, just email me and we can chat about it, and, work it out. So my plan um, is to complete uh, the lecture narrative by uh, by dealing with Laos and Cambodia. We've seen that in the early spring of 1975, um, the communists launched an offensive in Vietnam, and within a matter of weeks, um, in April, the Republic of Vietnam it collapsed, and the communists took over, and very quickly there was a unification process. Um, and I spoke in general terms about the consequences for Vietnam of this war, but we still have to deal with what happened to Laos and Cambodia, although one prominent author referred to them as sideshows, and they were sideshows in a sense, but especially toward the end of the war really spread throughout Indochina, and we saw there was upheaval in Laos, fighting, and likewise in more terrible form in Cambodia. So I want to deal with those things. Um, Now let's start with. Oh, by the way, I did see this movie, Don't Look Up. Uh, I hope that others have seen it as well. It's a Netflix movie. I strongly recommend it to you, especially, well, it deals with the main subject is climate change and the fact that uh, the people are ignoring it, especially the political elites, the upper class. They don't really want to face the full consequences of it um, because it means coming to terms with having to fundamentally change the whole system. And so they're basically avoiding the subject. That's the main thrust of the film. But along the way, there is a lot on disinformation and the media. And that's, I think, it's not as important, but it's important because a lot of what you get, I mean, it deals with the United States, and the disinformation is rampant, but it's also rampant here in Canada and from the top. Uh, the uh, uh, the government of the day, the governments, they don't really address the real issues facing people, and um, the um, especially it's bad when it comes to foreign affairs. You don't really get a real picture of what's Canada's role in the world really is. There's a lot of window dressing, and you need to sort of get to the bottom of it. And the only way that's possible is by first of all reading the business press. The business press is better than the ordinary media because the business people need to know what's going on, and so there are more factual treatments of circumstances. The other thing is you have to sort of research on Facebook, on YouTube. YouTube is a particularly good source of actually good political information if you know how to look. So you just keep looking around, and you can find the answers to some of the fundamental questions. So with that, I'm turning back to the narrative. So the collapse of the Republic of Vietnam in April '75 brought important changes to Laos as well. The wars by this point were intimately connected. And the main thing was, of course, American influence disappeared. American support for the Royal Laotian government disappeared, and therefore, as I had explained, this government in Vientiane, the capital, was so dependent on the United States that when the United States was no longer there to support it, it quickly unraveled. And this is what I'm talking about. Now, from the beginning, the Royal Laotian Army had trouble standing up to the Pathet Lao. Really, it was only the Hmong, remember those people up in the sort of near the Vietnamese border, these montagnards, these mountain people, or at least some of them. They supported the Royal Lao government. They were given huge subsidies by the United States. The dope trade worked. They raised opium, and the Americans marketed it. And so there was this relationship with a certain element amongst the Hmong. Now, on the other hand, the North Vietnamese, the PAVN, Hanoi was, of course, very important to supporting the Pathet Lao. They conducted joint operations. The PAVN was present in Laos, making sure that the Ho Chi Minh Trail was open. That was its primary role, but they also tried to attack the Hmong for protecting American radio bases along the border with North Vietnam, which were monitoring the signals of the PAVN and so on. And there were all kinds of fights between the Americans and the Hmong on the one hand, and the Pathet Lao and the PAVN concerning who would control these radio stations. But then you saw also extensive North Vietnamese operations along the Ho Chi Minh Trail. And we saw that in 1971, there was the South Vietnamese Army's attempt to interrupt the Ho Chi Minh Trail, and it led to this was Lam Son 719. And Lam Son 719 was a fiasco. The ARVN collapsed in the face of the assault by the PAVN. Indeed, by 1972, even the Hmong, who were supporting the Royal Laotian government, they had been so beaten about by the Pathet Lao and by the PAVN that their army began to wither, began to collapse, and disagreements broke out with the CIA operatives who were operating in their region. There were also Protestant missionaries who had a certain influence on these Hmong people, and there were frictions and so on. I might say at this point that it's important to note that eventually uh, the people, especially who had compromised themselves with the Americans, they had to leave Laos uh, when the communists were victorious. And many of them settled in Canada and in the United States. Um, but the um, the greater bulk of the Hmong, at least half of them remain in North Vietnam. They never were involved in this conflict. They didn't support the American side of the royal government. And furthermore, the Hmong are larger people. There's somebody told me there's something like um, there's something like 5 million Hmong. The great majority of the Hmong people live in southern China. They don't even live in Laos. So this is important to note. Well, in any case, when finally the Paris Peace Accords between the United States and the communists were signed in January 1974, this was an important turning point for Laos as well, because within weeks of the conclusion of the Paris Accords in Vietnam, the Pathet Lao and the Royal Laotian government reached an agreement. A new coalition government made up of members of the Royal Laotian government, neutrals, and members of the Pathet Lao were formed. You'll recall that in 1954 and again in 1962, in the course of this overall conflict, there had been coalitions, brief coalitions. Well, this was the third and the final coalition of 1974. By that point, the Pathet Lao, we're now in 1974, 4/5 of Laotian territory and about 40% of the population were under the control of the Pathet Lao. You have to remember, and I mentioned that the greater part of the population actually lived close to the Mekong River, in the delta of the Mekong River, in the sort of upper Mekong Valley, and the major towns like Viet Thanh and Luang Prabang, they were located in this region. The rest of the country was this hinterland was rather depopulated. So the Royal Laotian government actually still, right to almost to the end, controlled territory where the greater bulk of the population lived. That is to say, along the upper Mekong River Valley. But when finally the Republic of Vietnam collapsed in April 1975, this brought about the collapse of this coalition government, and really it led to the direct seizure of power by the Pathet Lao. The communists took power in April 75, just like in Vietnam. The same month, the communists took power in Laos. Because no sooner did news come of the fall of Saigon than demonstrations broke out in the main towns in favor of the Pathet Lao. This led on the 9th of May, 1975, to the resignation of the right-wing ministers in this coalition. And with their resignation, the sort of apparatus of the Royal Laotian government, the bureaucracy, the few members of the Royal Laotian Army that were left, the merchants, mainly of Chinese and Vietnamese origin, they simply fled. They fled across the Mekong river into Thailand. They took refuge in Thailand. And with that, by the summer of 1975, the Pathet had basically consolidated their control over the whole of Laos. Laos, like Vietnam, had become a communist country. I would say that Laos, of course, suffered terribly. Probably a million and a half people died during the conflict. So if you add that to the 4 million in Vietnam and the possible 3 million in Cambodia, that's a lot of people. You're looking at 8 million people who died during these Indochina wars. In any case, Laos has developed gradually under the communist rule. It's at peace. They have basically two ecological problems. First of all, the bombing, many unexploded ordnance lies. There was so much bombing during the war that people are still dying from the bombing that went on, and this is an ongoing problem. The other problem is development itself. The ecology of this region is delicate and beautiful. The Mekong River Valley is the main artery of the whole of Indochina, and the future ecology of the Mekong River Valley is a real question. And in Laos, in particular, with Chinese help, they're building a series of dams, hydroelectric dams, to provide electricity to the population. Well, it's an issue because what does the damming of the Mekong mean for Laos, and come to think of it, for Cambodia and for Vietnam itself? Well, this is an issue for Indochina, but of course, the whole question of development, the whole question of damming, the whole question of what the meaning of economic growth itself has become a huge issue that the whole of mankind is facing today. And so the Indochina is part of this. The last thing I heard about Laos was that the Chinese have finally completed a railway. You know, they have their famous trains, their 500-mile-per-hour trains that run all around China, and one of them now connects the Laotian capital, Vientiane, with Laos. Laos is no longer an isolated country, and that has, of course, implications. So now we're looking at, are there any questions about what I've said? Okay, we're going to move on now to Cambodia. Now, just let me find my place, if you will. We'll start from the point that Sihanouk was ousted. You'll remember there was a coup d'etat by Lon Nol with the support of the Americans in March of 1970. And no sooner was there a coup than Sihanouk called upon the peasantry to rise up against the usurper, Lon Nol, who was in the hands of the Americans. And sure enough, this coup occurred in the middle of March 1970, and in the whole latter part of March, all over Cambodia, the peasants actually did rise up, as spontaneous demonstrations by the peasantry. The king, who for them symbolized the unity of Cambodia, had been removed, and the peasants were supporters of the king, and so there was this uprising. It wasn't at all organized and so on. It didn't lead to the overthrow of Lon Nol, but nevertheless, it indicated where popular sentiment lay. Meanwhile, as that had happened, the Pathan, who were, of course, in their sanctuaries and along the Ho Chi Minh Trail, they began to advance toward Phnom Penh in an effort to sort of get rid of Lon Nol and restore Sihanouk. And the Lon Nol was not able to put up any kind of resistance. And most of the towns basically quickly fell to the Pavan, who, as soon as they seized one of these towns, they turned the administration over to the Khmer Rouge, these guerrillas, the Cambodian communist guerrillas, who were the armed wing of the Cambodian Communist Party. They quickly took over these towns. And this, of course, led to the American invasion. Nixon ordered in April 70 an invasion to help Lon Nol, which actually did succeed in helping Lon Nol to sort of restore some order and to consolidate some kind of regime in the capital, Phnom Penh. Now, as what we have then is a situation as follows. The peasantry were supporting the king. Lon Nol had control of Phnom Penh, and there was support for him. I've explained the split between the capital and the countryside. The urban middle class was strongly in support of the coup. They wanted American military and economic aid. They wanted an open economy. They wanted exports and imports to flow freely. They had turned against Sihanouk, so they supported the coup, and they thought that with American help, Lon Nol would be able to consolidate himself. And he was able, Lon Nol, to sort of increase the size of the Cambodian army to about 60,000 men. Meanwhile, given the collapse, particularly of the Cambodian, of Lon Nol's authority in the countryside, the Khmer Rouge were very active at this point, and tens of thousands of the peasants joined the Khmer Rouge army, a big guerrilla army. By 1972, it had 150,000 Khmer Rouge troops had developed, and they controlled about 85% of the Cambodian territory by 1972. The only areas that Lon Nol continued to control were Phnom Penh, the capital, and near Sihanoukville, the port, and the road linking the port to Phnom Penh that remained open as a kind of supply corridor. But for the rest of the country was in the hands of the Khmer Rouge. Indeed, in early January 1974, the Khmer Rouge actually tried to launch an offensive against Phnom Penh, to overrun Phnom Penh. They had about 150,000 troops. Well, they sent them against Phnom Penh in a big offensive. And they did this really independently of the Pavan. They were on their own. They tried to overrun the city. And the Americans responded with massive air power. By this point, the Americans were no longer bombing in Vietnam. So they had their whole air force in this region available. And so the offensive by the Khmer Rouge led to huge losses. The offensive, the so-called final offensive, was defeated by American air power in the spring of 1974. This first attempt at taking Phnom Penh was defeated. But of course, the bombing of Cambodia was extremely intense by the Americans. they continued to bomb. And this is after the Americans had stopped bombing in Vietnam. They were bombing very heavily in Cambodia in support of Lon Nol. And Sihanouk, who was not present on the scene, he was up in Beijing, uh, uh, where he was conducting radio broadcasts and so on, trying to reach his peasant supporters and so on. He remarked with regard to the American bombing, quote, this is a quote from Sihanouk, "With his bombs, President Nixon performed the miracle of turning our peasants, our peasant people into revolutionaries within weeks." In other words, the American bombing made the peasantries angry and was galvanizing them, especially the young people who were joining the Khmer Rouge en masse. Meanwhile, as the American bombing continued, the noose around Phnom Penh grew tighter and tighter. Lon Nol had trouble recruiting new troops because he had no territory. Most of the territory had been occupied by the Khmer Rouge, so he couldn't recruit further forces. And it was increasingly difficult to supply Phnom Penh by road from the sea. And so the American airlift in 1974, the Americans had to use cargo planes to bring in supplies. And the situation was getting bad in Phnom Penh because refugees from the countryside, the bombing was so heavy that hundreds of thousands of people fled toward Phnom Penh to escape the bombing. Indeed, by this point, Phnom Penh this population had swollen to 3 million people, including hundreds of thousands, if not millions of peasants were camping in the streets of Phnom Penh to avoid being bombed. Well, finally, on the 1st of January, 1975, and this is more or less, again, coincidence with what is going on in Vietnam and what is going on in Laos. The Khmer Rouge launched a final offensive. And on the 1st of April, 75, Lon Nol flies out of Phnom Penh. He flees the country. And on the 12th of April, the US embassy was abandoned. And on the 14th of April, the US airlift was suspended. The city became an open city. And on the 17th, the Khmer Rouge entered the city. So the Khmer Rouge take the city of Phnom Penh on the 17th of April. We should note that Saigon actually fell 2 weeks later. So the end in Cambodia came 2 weeks before it did in Vietnam. Now the Khmer Rouge had a real basis for their power, in the sense that they had been there were some Cambodian communists up in Vietnam and so on, in Hanoi during this whole period, but the base of the Khmer Rouge, as it developed, led by Pol Pot, in the course of this insurrection that began in the 1960s, they had developed a very strong organization. They had a good organizational base. And although the great majority of the peasants supported Sihanouk, nevertheless, there were real grievances. The peasants had real grievances in the form of land shortages, usury, exploitation, especially from the towns. I stress this is crucial to understand. The the split between Phnom Penh and the rural population, real hostility. And then, of course, when Lon Nol overthrew Sihanouk, this completely changed the situation, because the people the people in the countryside rejected Lon Nol, and they looked to the king. The king was the symbol of their national existence. And so, in the first instance, they supported the king. And for this reason, as the Khmer Rouge gained, in the wake of the Lon Nol, gained more and more territory and supporters, they invited Sihanouk to become the head of the new government in opposition to Lon Nol. They called the government the Royal Government of Khmer National Unification. And they made Sihanouk the head of this government. He was the symbol for Cambodia. And the peasants, as soon as they heard about this, this was their government. The Khmer, the Khmer royal government under Sihanouk was what they looked to. And indeed, in some places, the Cambodian army, loyal to Lon Nol, went over to the Khmer Rouge as soon as they heard word of this Khmer National Unification government. But Sihanouk up in Beijing was drawing his own conclusions. And at a time, he gave an interview in the course of 1974 in which he was asked about his relationship to the Khmer Rouge. And he spoke as follows: "The Khmer Rouge do not like me at all. Ooh la la." It's a French expression, ooh la la. This is a French interview. "The Khmer Rouge do not like me at all. I understand quite well that they only tolerate me because without me, they cannot prevail over the peasants. Without the peasants, one can make no revolution in Cambodia. It is clear to me, when they no longer need me, they will spit me out like a cherry pit. They will spit me out like a cherry pit." So he was under no illusions about the Khmer Rouge. And remember, Sihanouk had persecuted the Khmer Rouge in the time that he was firmly in the seat of power. And the animosity between the two the animosities were deep and real. Indeed, as time wore on, the Khmer Rouge gained more confidence and more influence amongst the peasants, especially as this fighting proceeded, and more of the young people became subject to Khmer Rouge indoctrination. They came under the influence of the Khmer Rouge, and they were influenced by their ideology. I need to. At the same time as this was happening, the relationship between the Khmer Rouge, at this point, the Khmer Communist Party under Pol Pot, the Khmer Rouge is what I'm calling them, and the Hanoi and the Vietnamese communists began to seriously disintegrate. In particular, the signing of the Paris Peace Accords at the end of January 1973 had a serious effect on this relationship between the Cambodian Communist Party and the Vietnamese Communist Party, because the Cambodians regarded this as the Cambodians were excluded from the peace agreement. There was no, the Cambodians weren't even consulted by the Vietnamese. And so the Cambodian communists, who had been long furious at the way the Vietnamese had basically used Cambodia as a kind of instrument for pursuing their own policies in Vietnam, pursuing their own war without consultation, and for trying to dominate Cambodian communism. In particular, the fact that the Vietnamese communists had good relations with Sihanouk, who was persecuting the Cambodian Communist Party. This really had always rankled Pol Pot and the other members of the Khmer Rouge. And so the signing of the Paris Peace Accord was the last straw from their point of view. All the worse, it meant that US bombers were now free. They were no longer bombing in Vietnam. They bombed Cambodia. That was the view of the Khmer Rouge. So that was the general situation. Well, in April 75, the Khmer Rouge take over. And no sooner did they take over Phnom Penh, 3 million people, when they immediately order that the whole population has to leave and move into the countryside. 3 million people. Of course, some of them were peasants and were country people, but nevertheless, they basically, the Khmer Rouge Army orders the population in Phnom Penh to evacuate the city, including merchants, artisans, workers, the lot, are ordered basically into the countryside. Now, this becomes a subject of contention and debate to this day. Why did the Khmer Rouge do this? Well, partly it's clear that they wanted to gain control over the population. The population, the permanent population, was hostile to them. They wanted to control them, so move them into the countryside, I guess. But also there were the fact that Phnom Penh had been cut off for weeks, if not for months, and the economic situation, the health situation in the city was bad, and so that might have been supplying these people with food, health problems, and so on. There was also a fear of possible, a kind of a paranoid fear of further American air attacks. I've made a point of stressing these air attacks, and people, were in a way paranoid. It's a fear that the American bombers might be called back. But also, we have to not discount the fundamental ideological positions of the Khmer Rouge, which, as I explained to you, was extremely hostile to Phnom Penh and the urban population. They believed the urban population was parasitic, and that the way they had developed their ideology based on, remember that PhD thesis written way back in Paris, that the Cambodian communism has to be based on self-reliance, autonomy, indeed autarky, and it has to be built from the rural areas. The cities are bad, and we have to build our socialism from the countryside. While this policy was enforced, as I say, they drove 3 million people into the countryside, and it's disputed, but it could be that as many as 2 million Cambodians perished during this period. So if you look at the situation, perhaps somewhat over 1 million died prior to this under the American bombing. And then between 1975 and 78, while the Khmer Rouge were in power, it could be as many as 2 million people died. So that's 3 million out of 8 million Cambodians. All told, I estimated the overall casualties and the killing dead in Indochina during this whole phase at something like 8 million people. Well, who are the people who died? Well, Clearly, the members of the Lon Nol government died. Also, dissident communists. There were many communists who disagreed with these Khmer Rouge policies, and they also were executed. But the great majority were the urban dwellers, the city folk, the craftsmen, the workers, the merchants. These are the people. Some of them were executed, but for the most part, what you're dealing with is basically they're driven into the countryside. They're not used to rural life. They're overworked because their work was supervised, and they disappeared. Um, uh, but we should say that looking at this whole situation, um, certainly the split between the rural and the urban population, the peasants hated the urban dwellers, and this likely played a role in these terrible events. Now, I might note that Marx, who's supposedly inspiration for all of this, he does mention in the Communist Manifesto the split between the town and the country is one of the fundamental features of capitalism. That's true. And he thought that socialism should end the split between the rural people and the urban people. But of course, this idea of a sort of rurally based communism was foreign to his ideas, and certainly the Soviets and even the Chinese communists never really accepted the idea that communism should be built from the rural base. I know that Mao placed a lot of stress on the peasants and so on, but fundamentally, the role of heavy industry, the whole of cities, remains important to Maoism as it does to Stalinism. In any case, this clearly this Khmer Rouge regime was its days were numbered. It was based on such a degree of irrationality that it could not survive. And indeed, its life was ended. It came to power in April 1975. Well, it was ended by an invasion by the Vietnamese in December 1978. So it lasted 3 years. And so the last things I have to say have to do with ultimately the war between Cambodia and Vietnam, which ultimately ended, if you can believe it, in a brief war between Vietnam and China itself. The whole conflict ended in this fiasco of first the war between the communists in Cambodia and then those in Vietnam, and ultimately a brief struggle between China and Vietnam. Why did the Vietnamese invade Cambodia in December 1978? Why did they attack the Khmer Rouge? Well, because the Khmer Rouge provoked them. I have explained the background. The bitter feelings that the Khmer Rouge felt to Hanoi and to the Vietnamese communists. They had always treated the Cambodian communists with condescension. If you recall the history from the formation of the Indochina Communist Party in the early 1930s, there were few Cambodians, and the Vietnamese Communist Party and the Cambodian wing of the Indochina Communist Party was essentially made up of Vietnamese living in Cambodia. And even when in 1951 an independent Cambodian Communist Party came into being, the majority of the leadership were still Vietnamese. This was resented even then. And this sense of being treated with the condescension was increased under Sihanouk because the Vietnamese communists basically took a position: we need Sihanouk's neutrality, and therefore we want to be allies with Sihanouk, even though he has outlawed the Cambodian Communist Party. So all of this rankled the Pol Pot and the other leaders of the Khmer Rouge. And when they did take power, they therefore were determined to assert Cambodian independence. And they used hostility to Vietnam to deflect domestic dissent and to achieve internal unity. One of the ways that states one of the ways they can achieve internal cohesion is by invoking the external enemy. This is what the Khmer Rouge did. They said the Vietnamese communists are not our brothers. They've always used us, and we have to basically be in opposition to them. And they were supported in this position, believe it or not, by Beijing. Beijing supported the Khmer Rouge. Why was this? Well, because of the Nixon visit to China in 1972. Remember the rapprochement with the United States. And the Chinese, Mao, got together with the United States. Didn't ask Hanoi's permission. Hanoi, from that point, although Mao continued to send supplies to Vietnam, the diplomatic relationship between Beijing and Hanoi was bad from 1972. And the Vietnamese, Hanoi, became allies of Moscow. And that conflict between Moscow and Beijing was going on. Vietnam joined the Moscow camp. And therefore, in response, now China supports the Khmer Rouge. Border clashes began to develop from 1970 between the Khmer Rouge and the Vietnamese from 1976 onwards. They got more and more serious, 1966, 1977. And finally, the Vietnamese the Vietnamese army makes a thrust into Cambodia in early 1978. In conjunction to that, the Vietnamese, they send a small force to confront the Khmer Rouge army. Then on December 3rd, Radio Hanoi announces the setting up of the Khmer United Front for National Salvation. In other words, what they've done is there are up in Hanoi some Cambodians who have always been close to the Vietnamese communists, who agreed with their policies against the Khmer Rouge. Well, these become the nucleus of a united front of Cambodians against what they consider to be the monstrous Khmer Rouge regime, which is killing its own people. And as a result, in December 1978, the PAVN, the Vietnamese army, invades Cambodia in force, in large numbers, and the Khmer Rouge collapse. And a new government, which is basically a puppet government of Hanoi, takes power in Phnom Penh. A new communist government is established in Phnom Penh. The Khmer Rouge are ousted, and the Vietnamese army is now in control. This sets off a brief war between China and Vietnam. China says, this is militarism, you have to be taught a lesson. And so the Chinese invade the north of Vietnam. They don't do that well. The Vietnamese actually hold their ground. But what is the meaning of all this? The meaning of this is the collapse of sort of the internationalism of the international communist movement. That had already started with the Sino-Soviet split. But you can see in these last conflicts, Cambodia and Vietnam, Vietnam against China, China against the Soviet Union, that the sort of internationals that was created by the Third International way back during the Russian Revolution has come to an end. Well, with this, I'm going to break off, and the next time we're going to be focusing on the review questions. So onward, people, until we finish up.